Of opposition, we now call on the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the address.
Dealing with something as ethereal as your ability to be able to hone your mind to focus on specific skills that you were supposed to be taught in your most formative years, that it is important that in this case, in this very specific case, that Joanna and I are willing to say that we would rather hide something than face it head on, because we think that by implementing this, we manage to achieve the greatest amount of benefits. And we think that to negate the benefits that you achieve on our side is simply ludicrous. So let's quickly do 2 points of rebuttal, and then I've got 3 points of argumentation. So Duan tells us how these children are not going to participate potentially, how they can't communicate because of all of these negative side effects that they have because of this medication. So we'd say that this is not necessarily true in the large, overwhelming majority of cases. And even if it is so, then usually your dosage is going to be limited, but it's also the difference of being able to see whether your child works with Ritalin better or whether they work better with conceal. So we'd say that it's a mischaracterization to say that en masse these children become absolute recluses. But we'd say that even if this is the case, that we would argue that it is better for these children to be seen as introverts, or to be seen as people that don't necessarily make friends as easily, simply by virtue of their personality, rather than the fact that we are able to tell all of the kids, hey, listen, so this child has a syndrome, or a disease, or something that's wrong with them, and in these formative years, kids tend to be cruel enough to be able to tell them this, and then for this child to still be ostracized by their behavior. So now it's twofold that they have to deal with this. We'd argue that it's better for kids to just be able to go, well, you have a different personality type, not that you have a different disease. But we think that even that is in the minority of cases, and in the large overwhelming majority of the cases, these kids do react well to this type of medication, but you choose which characterization you got. Okay, secondly, how apparently it's really important that these children must know, these children are going to be really inquisitive, and so maybe they'll know, right? They're not going to buy the whole you're taking a vitamin pill for forever, right? So Johan and I would argue that as good parents, the decision that we're making is that for as long as what we can possibly shield you from you fulfilling this prophecy, of which we heard little contestation of how it is that they're not going to go, oh, well, I can't concentrate, so I can't do well. Oh, well, I can't concentrate, so I can't reach my greatest life trajectory. That we would argue that for as long as possible, we would shield them from them being able to excuse their true potential, and we think that that is perfectly fine. Okay, but you know what, even if they do find out, then we'd go, listen, hey, let's sit down and have a conversation. As your parents, we didn't want the perception from the rest of society being pushed upon you, and it's for this reason that we hid it from you. Okay, so points of positive action. So let's quickly look at my first argument here about the power of the mind. And so this is not a ailment that we're dealing with here of okay, you are someone who is born without a leg, right? That's not something you're going to be able to hide from the kid. But in the case of this, we're dealing with something that is far more mental. And huge amounts of the brain are not yet understood or discovered. It's why it's such a gray area of what exactly does it mean to be diagnosed with ADHD or not. And so we argue that hiding it from this kid is something that's far better to be able to do for their mental capabilities. So people are able to think themselves better from a common cold, or when they're able to think themselves more awake when they are sleep deprived. These are all things that our mind can do. And while we're not for one moment saying this kid is going to be able to think themselves to have better hormonal levels, this is what the medication is for, we're arguing that in this in-between gray area, it is possible, should they not have this excuse to fall back on, to be able to determine what is their unlimited life trajectory. And it never gets contested with when Yuan says that these kids have the ability to be able to determine whatever it is that they want when they are not limited by the excuse that because you don't fit into the rigid schooling system right now, we would argue that the Steve Jobs and the Albert Einsteins and the Bill Gates of this world wouldn't have been where they had been if they had been told, well, your ability to not be able to concentrate on the relatively anal skills of having to learn to write neatly and do basic arithmetic are things that we wouldn't want for any child ever. I'd like to take closing, but they're quiet, so I'll take opening.
Okay, Michelle, so wouldn't you say that it's a lot easier to hone your mind as you speak of when I actually know how to do it? Like in the case of sleep deprivation, if I know I've got a medical problem, I can deal with it accordingly.
Yeah, but you see, the thing is, you don't go, I can hone my mind, when the very thing you've been told about ADHD is that you have an inability to hone your concentration skills, right?
Yeah.
Let's just not tell them that they don't have this ability, and we think that it's more likely that they could potentially develop this ability when their parents, their school, and their society hasn't told them they can't. Let's quickly look at the standardization of good teaching practices, because this is a big argument that's made. Okay, and I can take you.
Do you think you'll be able to develop even better when you're aware of your disabilities?
No, we don't think so, and we've argued this over and over again. We think that the greatest opportunity for you to be just like a kid without ADHD is by attempting to emulate as far as possible the life of a kid without ADHD.
Yeah.
Right. So the standardization of good teaching practices, we hear how apparently like, oh, but then the teachers need to know. What about your medication? What about the fact that they're not going to see how you're going to be left behind? This is the problem. The self-fulfilling prophecy that John speaks to you about, wait, teachers should care about their students regardless of what ailment it is that they do or don't have. There can be kids that literally just don't have the ability to be good at math and they get left behind and they've got no ADHD in any way, shape or form. When you allow these teachers to know about it, it's an excuse for them to go, sorry your kid isn't doing so well, but you know, they have an ailment, right? So we argue, under our model, you get the standardization of good teaching regardless of your supposed ailment or not. And so then our last and final argument, is it better to hide something rather than to face it head on? And so I touched on this in my introduction, and we'd say that in this very specific case, because the mind is so ethereal, because it's relatively difficult to understand, that this one isolated instance is an incident of where we're willing to say, let us hide from a kid what it is that they have been told by society they can't do, and rather allow them to be able to believe that they can do anything that they want to do, use in conglomeration with this medication to be able to regulate hormonal levels that they simply can't. And we think that under our policy you achieve the best type of benefits. The benefits that are not necessarily going to be something that you would get if you were open and honest. And so in this case, in this instance, we are not for open and honest or transparent. We would hide it, and we're proud to.
Yeah.